Now we're going to go straight to our perspective guest on the programme, and it is a film that really pulls at your heartstrings, showing the life of an incredible woman with a fascinating history as she struggles to leave her family flat in Brazil to head to a new life in Portugal. And it's filmed and produced by her granddaughter. Carolina Sá is a Portuguese-Brazilian journalist, filmmaker and podcast director. The film, her first, which translates in English as To Say Goodbye, a very intimate portrait of her grandmother's farewell to her life in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The material gathered, also crafted as well, into a new narrative, this time in the form of a radio documentary or a podcast. Well, before we talk to Carolina, let's watch the trailer.
Tá tão complicado, Carol, pra minha idade. Deus me livre. Nunca imaginei tempo assim, Carolina. Senhora? Senhora. Boa tarde. Boa.
Que é isso aqui?
As duas.
É o véu?
Não.
500?
Não, 3. Tem essa bandeja de prata?
3.
3.500.
Eu sei. 3.300, 400, 3.500.
Com certeza, já não é a mesma
Já
casa.
não é.
Mudou muito, cara.
Desapega, desapega. Ah, LX. Vamos, vamos. Vamos.
Não, assim eu vou.
Pra gente terminar
largar.
logo, pra senhora relaxar.
Mas não é pra ficar assim, vamos, que eu fico aflita. Por que eu tô fazendo isso? Se eu não vendi, eu volto.
It is a beautiful film. I've watched it all the way through, and Carolina's joining us here on set. Carolina, by the way, quick disclosure, is actually the producer of this programme. So usually you're talking in my ear, so it's very strange to have you sitting there talking about your film instead. Tell us about the film, though. How did it all begin?
It all began in 2009. I just moved to Brazil. I'm half Brazilian, half Portuguese. Brazilian through my mother's side and grandmother's side. It was always my second home. And I was so happy to be living this lifelong dream of finally living in Brazil. And yet I struggled enormously to adapt, to kind of understand the social rules, the social boundaries, the social divides, and the social codes. I felt more European than ever. And I struggled to find my place in this new society that I'd never lived in. At the same time, I spent enormous amounts of time at my grandmother's house. And every time I walked through that red door, it was as though I traveled in time and space, not only because of the decoration of the apartment, the objects inside the apartment, but especially because of the relationship and the two worlds that existed within the apartment, which were my grandmother and Jaciara, who lived and worked there for 32 years. And so you had these two very opposite, very different worlds living side by side, divided by a corridor, living parallel lives, but at the same time that don't mix, that don't really, intertwine.
Yeah.
And so I felt that what I was struggling to make sense of outside in society in Rio de Janeiro, I had a miniature version of that inside the apartment. And I thought, I think that getting my camera and filming and observing them was a way of trying to understand and make sense of what I was seeing and struggling to try to understand.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it? Capture that really deeply personal space that we see between them. Carries a very strong feminine perspective as well. Tell us about the two characters.
So the film has two main characters. They're all female characters, but two main characters, which are Dona Terezinha, my grandmother, this beautiful lady who was born in 1928 in a cocoa plantation in the interior of Bahia in Brazil, the daughter of a prosperous landlord who would come back from his many travels and give her everything that she wanted. She was raised in the best schools in Salvador and educated really to be an exemplary housewife, to find a good husband and to have a good marriage. And the other main character is Jaciara, who is also born in Bahia, but in an opposite world. She was the eldest of many siblings, and at the age of 12, she had to drop out of school to help her mother, and she never learned how to read and write. She had 4 children very early on, each one from a different father, and none of these men ever assumed the responsibility or the paternity of the children. And so she had to fend for herself. And she moved to Rio to find a job, and she was quickly hired by Dona Terezinha. And so these are the two opposite worlds that exist within the apartment.
You put it to me that there's a third character in this film, and you're quite right, because it's the flat itself, isn't it? It's an incredible flat with 2 amazingly different views. Tell us about it.
Exactly. So there's a very striking geography in the apartment. Again, these 2 worlds living side by side, not touching each other, which is when you go through that red door, you have the beautiful Copacabana Bay view, the postcard iconic Rio de Janeiro, where you see the fireworks, the beautiful Rio. And you cross that corridor and you go to the rear side of the apartment, and there you have the view of a shanty town, and where people live in very precarious conditions and have nothing. So once again, you have these 2 worlds living a few meters apart from each other, side by side, and not kind of touching each other. And I felt that the geography of the apartment was as telling as the 2 women that existed within the apartment.
It's taken you 10 years, hasn't it, to film this? I mean, how did you decide what to put in and what to miss out?
So I had a lot of material because there were 3 main filming blocks. There was 2009, which was when I started to film, and there it was more of a game. I originally started to film the 2 women whilst they watched the novella. The novella in Brazil is kind of this sacred ritual, which is as important as carnival and football. And why it is important is because it brings together people from all walks of life. Those social barriers that are so present everywhere are suddenly erased. And these 2 women would sit, one in the kitchen, one in the living room, to watch the same soap opera. And then at halftime, they would meet to discuss the latest episode. And so I started to film them watching that. That was my first period, let's say. Then I left Brazil, moved to Europe, came back 10 years later, and everything had changed. There was no more novella. My grandmother had dropped the novella to watch Netflix. And Jaciara, because of the new laws that Dilma and Lula had put into place, didn't have to sleep at her boss's house anymore. And she left the house every day at 5 p.m. And when that happened, she became a very devoted evangelical. And she'd go every day to church. And so obviously, and my grandmother had also aged. So these 2 they drifted apart. And then I came back in 2020, which was when COVID hit, and I came to help my grandmother do what was the unimaginable before, which was pack up her apartment to leave Brazil and move to Portugal close to her family.
Just got time to squeeze in 2 more questions. First of all, this must have been very emotional for you as well, filming this.
It was incredibly emotional, and I think I'll take a few years to process everything that I lived during that period. But I think that because of the lens and because of the camera, I was able to kind of give a certain step backwards and observe and have a notion of what I was seeing in front of my eyes. And I was surrounded by 2 very strong women who come from another generation and who've been taught to just, you get on with it. When life's tough, you don't sit and cry, and they just get on with it. And I think I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. Finally, Caroline, I mean, you actually turned it as well, using the same material, but you turned it as well, didn't you, into a radio documentary or a podcast. It's an hour long. It's sort of similar, but at the same time, it's very different, isn't it?
It is, and I think when I finished the film, and I think many people can relate to this, I felt a kind of baby blues because I'd been carrying this film for so long, and suddenly there was this emptiness, this story and these characters that had accompanied me for so long were no longer with me. And as I was tidying up all my tapes and material, I thought, there's so much that I recorded that I haven't used. I think I could try to give life to another form. And I'd always dreamt of working with radio. And I wrote up a radio documentary, which is much more political. And the idea was much more to kind of draw a cross-portrait between what was happening on the streets and in politics in Brazil and how that was reflected in the life within the apartment and the relationship between the two women.
Both of them work beautifully well. Carolina, great to have you with us here on set. Very nice to talk to you here in the studio instead of through my earpiece. But the film is called To Say Goodbye in English. What's it in Portuguese?
Dizer Adeus.
Perfectly pronounced. She always tells me off for my pronunciation, so good to get the proper pronunciation from Carolina Saar and that wonderful film.